And welcome to today's seminar hosted by the International Equality Institute. I'm Paolo Bronori. I'm Associate Professorial Research Fellow at the III, and today's speaker is Professor Markus Jäntti, who is Professor and Director of the Swedish Institute of Social Research, SOFI, at Stockholm University. He has extensive experience in studying inequality and intergenerational mobility and mobility in general. He has covered a number of key roles in the field. For example, he was research director of this, the Oxford research study. He's the author of dozens of influential papers, especially methodological papers. I checked the slides, they are approachable, so don't worry, don't run away. And today we present a joint paper with Jesper Roine on international income mobility and assortative mating in Sweden. As usual, there will be a chance to ask questions for the audience in presence and online. I think Mark may tolerate some clarification questions, but please let the more substantial question for the end. We'll now end up with you. Thanks for coming, for accepting the invitation, and welcome to the II.
Thank you, Austin, for the generous presentation. So this is joint work with Jesper, and it's I seem to have dropped the word trends from the title. This is very much about trends in intergenerational income mobility, and yeah, that's actually so. That we're looking at, but we're trying essentially to address the following question. So is intergenerational persistence socially desirable or not? I'll be looking then at if intergenerational persistence has changed across time in Sweden, and then, given the changes we observe, can we give a welfare interpretation to the trends? And of course, this is going to be in a relatively limited sense, which I'll try to make clear later on. But I became interested in the issue of if mobility, income mobility is socially desirable or not. When I was working with Stephen Jenkins on a chapter for the Handbook of Income Distribution, this is something on which there was a quite considerable. A lot of attention was paid to this issue in the late 1970s and early 1980s, but then interest in it has kind of dropped, and many take it for granted that mobility is a good. But it's not entirely clear why you should think that, and I'll get to that. And in fact, my work on this here in this presentation has also otherwise been inspired by work done here at the LSE by Tony Atkinson, the late Tony Atkinson, in two different ways. But this is what this talk is about. Now, anybody who's been following literature on income mobility in the past few decades will be aware that there's been a very great interest lately in absolute income mobility, following the work of Jäntti and many co-authors for the US and to some extent comparatively. Also, while the background of the work that Jesper and I have done here is in fact because we were asked to look at absolute mobility. I'm not here going to be looking at that issue. Relative intergenerational income mobility has been studied for a very long time. Handbook of Labor Economics chapter by Gary Sol reviews the work up until 2000s. Then Stephen and I and somewhat immodestly, I'm citing myself down here twice, but it's both review type papers, which is why I mentioned. There are other reviews as well, which I probably should have talked about, including, in fact, very interesting, or very nice reviews by Joe Blandon here in the UK. On narrative sorting, there's an enormous literature in sociology as well as in economics. Rolf Wahlberg and his co-authors have a review on this issue as well. I'll be explaining why marital sorting enters into the picture later on. And I think it's important to acknowledge that when you think about intergenerational social mobility, if you will, there's a very large and still expanding literature in sociology that looks at both within and across countries on intergenerational mobility. And I'm citing here Robert Eriksson and John Goldthorpe's book, The Constant Flux. It's one of the best social science books I've ever read. It's very thick, and while it's by now much time has passed since it was published, I think it's still very much worth reading. But I won't be talking much more about that. Now, Stephen likes to put studies of income mobility as needing to resolve 3 W questions. At the outset, mobility among whom, mobility of what population are you looking at, mobility of what resource variable are you looking at, and then there are multiple when questions which relate to timing. For instance, at what age should you measure people's resources? What period should you be looking at? How long periods, and so on. Now, much of the economics literature on intergenerational mobility solves the whom and what question very simply by focusing on men, looking at father-son pairs, and very often looks at labor income in both generations, which is a very narrow view, I think. It is in part explained because many of the researchers doing work in this field come from labor economics, and in labor economics it's very difficult to think that men and women operate in different labor markets, and also the relevant income concept in labor economics tends to be labor income. Those who come from a income distribution perspective or background tend to think that equivalent disposable household income, in fact, rather than family income, equivalent disposable family income, that is, the income that is at your disposal for consumption or savings, adjusted for family structure, is the most welfare relevant of the income concepts. Of course, all persons count equal in an income distribution perspective. So this narrow focus on father and sons of earnings doesn't feel quite right, so to speak. But once we do bring in disposable family or household income, then naturally the resources of other members of the household, and in particular of adults in the family, which typically would be married or cohabiting couple, and then you need to think of assortative mating as well. These are some estimates from the UK, from data that Tony Atkinson and co-authors published work, in fact, data were collected here at the LSE, and among others by Stephen Jenkins, although Stephen worked on this project even a few years ago. The first 2 sets of estimates come from the first publication from that project in Economics Letters, that the next 2 are from the book, Atkinson, Maynard, and trend, but this kind of points to some of these issues. So the first two estimates are for men only on weekly earnings, that is labor earnings. But you'll know that the first is for father-son pairs, the other is for father and son-in-law pairs. And the regression coefficient for the in-laws is substantially higher for the own pairs. They say that they'll investigate the reason for this later on, but in fact, I haven't been able to find any further work on that particular thing. But it does point to this, that there's the whom question, paying close attention to it matters. But more to the point here, the next one is for disposable income and for parents and children. That is, now we've expanded to disposable income and to all persons. And this is now much lower, about half as low as the other one. So the intergenerational, this is why I'm very much of this literature looks at persistence, that is regression coefficients, which is why I don't use the term. Well, I sometimes use them interchangeably, but this, what I'm doing here is very much about persistence rather than mobility. You can, in fact, construct examples where you could have a comparison of two longitudinal populations where you have a greater persistence but more mobility in the other one. That's probably rare, but we're all the same. This, I think, so even early on, so to speak, you can see that these estimates really depend very much on how you solve these W issues. Now we have parents here in the columns and different kinds of offspring. In the rows, father-son pairs look only at this cell. If we look at both parents and all offspring, we're in this cell here. But I cover all of these in what follows. And of course, then there's the issue of disposable income. We typically think of disposable income as consisting of earnings, capital income, which together are factor income. Then we add public transport transfers. Subtract direct taxes to get to disposable income. This isn't. There are things you might argue that you should value add to this the value of public services and make some adjustment for sales taxes or value-added taxes and so on. But for this, disposable income is relatively widely considered to be a thing, the distribution of which many people are interested in. And this, of course, is an empirical fact. This is the kind of thing that is, in fact, looked on in different countries. And then, of course, we have family members for data-driven reasons. I won't be working with a wider household concept. I have a narrow view of the family here, which is going to consist of married couples and their children, if they are under 18. And then, of course, we look at single individuals and lone parents. We're unable in our data to take into account cohabiting couples. So they'll be treated as unrelated individuals. That's unfortunate, but that's the way the data came to us. But we do construct family income by adding across rows to get to the family income. But I won't be looking at the sum of earnings and factor incomes for the wife and the husband. So I'll be looking at individual earnings, individual factor incomes, individual disposable income, and then family income. So I have 4 different income concepts here. Now, this is the second stage at which I was inspired by some unpublished work, in fact, of Tony Atkinson about the welfare economics. So as I said, often it's taken for granted that intergenerational income mobility is good. Conversely, persistence is bad. Now, the more formal basis in the sense of formality in welfare economics for this rests nowadays, I think, largely on work by Tony Atkinson and Francois Bourguignon in a utilitarian framework. And the way that works is that, and it applies equally to intra-individual income mobility. You take pairs of persons that are related to each other, so the father-son pair typically, or an individual's income at different points in time. And then you can show formally what you must assume about social preferences for mobility to be a good thing in this framework. That's the Atkinson-Bourguignon approach. In the equality of opportunity framework, which has, in fact, there are other citations one could give in addition to John Romer's here, but and people here have contributed tremendously to this literature. You could think of a different kind of welfare economic approach to this, and in the mobility context, you would need to think of parental income as the only circumstance, and then you can argue that having more mobility in some sense might be a good thing. There's somewhat more complicated there. But the point of the utilitarian approach in Atkinson and Bourguignon, the way at least it's typically used, is that you need to treat the parent-offspring pair as the unit of analysis, or you could possibly have multiple generations, but it has to be a dynasty. You, in a sense, have to go in one direction only. Now, in that framework, Tony Atkinson gave a talk, which I thought was very interesting. What he demonstrates is that once you start putting relatively simple structure on this, intergenerational mobility is good, but so is intragenerational. So they play very similar roles. So the way Tony set this up is that here we have 3 generations. I won't actually be using that. But you have parental permanent income, which is observed. You observe annual incomes, in a sense, realizations of that permanent income, and you have an intra-generational correlation of R between your permanent income and the annual incomes. And then across generations, you have a similar setup of permanent income and annual incomes realized from that permanent income, and these permanent incomes are related by an intergenerational persistence parameter of beta. Here we, for simplicity, and indeed further on, we're going to assume these are stationary, so all of these betas and R's are the same. But this, of course, is a dynastic view of these things, which is the one often taken also. So, you can, if you take the social evaluation function, or you can think of this, or indeed you probably have to think of this as looking at, from an ex-ante perspective, taking the parents' perspective, their well-being depends on the permanent incomes of their own income, their own permanent income, and the offspring permanent income. And here, again, to get anywhere, I'll assume it's the sum of the natural logarithms of those permanent incomes and a discount factor, so which typically we assume to be slightly less than 1, but still positive, and then we have a normalizing theta here. And we'll measure social welfare again to make life simple by the negative of the variance of parental utility in this population, which is the sum of the log variances of both generations' incomes. We have the discount factor, and then we have the covariance term, which is how we get one of the ways in which we get the income in here. And long story short, we kind of assume the variances are the same across generations, and the thing reduces this expression. The particular form you don't need to worry about so much, but what is important here is that this is the intergenerational persistence, this is the intragenerational persistence, and social welfare is declining in both of these parameters. So the more intergenerational persistence you have, the lower social welfare. But the more intragenerational persistence you have, the lower is social welfare. Of course, this is highly simplified, but at least it's a way to formalize this. Yes.
At the same time, there's no implied relationship between R and delta.
No, there's no. Delta is just whatever the discount factor.
No, I'm sorry. Between the intragenerational mobility and the
there's no. This is completely non-behavioral. This is total statistical. So you're thinking of the Great Gatsby curve.
No.
Yeah. There's no behavior here. This is purely a way of comprising the statistical distributional parameters and interpreting the variance in welfare terms. Now, okay, so
Markus,
yes,
sorry, can you show the utility function again?
Yes, this one.
So it's sum of those odds.
Yes.
Permanent income. So it's a function of permanent income only. So there's no sort of risk aversion. There's no aversion to income fluctuation, right?
No, and
because
last time you were subjected to this talk, you
made the same point.
You asked the same question.
Well, at least I'm consistent.
But this time I have an answer. There's no, and of course this goes back to Tony's work. And I didn't think this quite as much through as I should have, but there's no. I think the reason these income fluctuations don't really come into this is that we assume the utility really only depends here on permanent income, and that's why. So this function doesn't depend on these annual things at all. It's just that we measure them through the annual things, and that's why then the intergenerational correlation comes in.
But all I'm saying is, if it is in other settings very standard to think that you have some sort of concave function on a stream of current incomes, meaning that I would prefer to get the same salary every year rather than twice and then zero and then twice and then zero. And if that were the case, then it's not obvious that R would always be of the same sign as beta.
And of course, the key reason that's not happening here is this formulation. Some people are trying to apply. So of course, the welfare economics of mobility didn't really end in 1982. Of course, there's been later work, and Peter Gottschalk and Enrico Spolare, they have a later paper where they do look at those kinds of things. But even there, that does not combine inter and intra-generational mobility. It really is. You need to interpret the sub-T's as either different generations or different points of time for the individual. And of course, this is the setup here, and that's the reason it comes out. Now, so what I've done is I've run through with a few simplifications. I've done the same thing, but now in the offspring generations, we have a couple, both of whom have a permanent income. They have annual deviations from that permanent income and so on. In the parental generation, there are two sets of parents. I've collapsed the parental incomes on both sides to just a single one. To simplify matters, of course, we have kind of two sets of parents here. But the added parameter here is the assortative mating, the correlation between the permanent incomes of the, we're looking at same-sex couples here, so of the wife and the husband in a couple. So we have intergenerational persistence, we have intragenerational persistence, and now we have assortative mating as well. And then I've run through the same statistical model, but with this complication. And the result is this expression, which I've dropped the sigma for some reason. Okay, sigma 1. But now the negative of the variance depends in the same way on intragenerational persistence, intergenerational persistence, and the assortative mating parameter. So social welfare is declining in all three of these. And so, of course, this isn't rocket science, but all the same, this is what the expansion leads to. And among the simplifications that have been made here is that the persistence is the same in all directions in the intergenerational link and so on. Of course, that's a complication, a simplification of. But in fact, I'll show you evidence on that particular question. So the data we use stem from mostly tax registers in Sweden, covering the period 1968 to 2018. 1967 is, for reasons nobody's figured out, lost. There are some limited data for 1960 to 66, but we don't use those here, in part because those are available only for part of the population, whereas these are available for anybody who filed a tax reform. I'm going to focus on incomes during a few years, and in what I'm showing here, it's a 5-year average for everybody, and it's centered on age 40. The oldest parents in our data are born in 1930, so they were 40 in 1970. The youngest offspring we are looking at were born in 1976, so they were 14 in 2016. We know the marital status, number of the children, and we have the children of everybody. We know their place of birth, their educational attainment, and so on. I'm not going to be using the place of birth here. Because we're looking at the intergenerational links, essentially everybody needs to have been born in Sweden to be in these data. And it's based on population registers, so these are population data, not sample. This shows you, so we look at pairs of offspring, so we start from 1950 and 51 and so on. And we go to 1974 and 75. We've dropped 1976 because we can't pair them with 77, but that's I don't always notice that happens. This shows the range of parental birth years for each of the cohorts. And you will notice that early on we have a narrower set. Because some of the when questions here, you have to nail down these kind of things. But you also need to nail down what the age difference maximally is between parents and children. So here it's 20 to 30 years. So we're looking at parent-child pairs where the parents were between 20 and 30 while they were born. That's something we should have done some sensitivity analysis on, but haven't. So we have the 4 income concepts. Okay, so from what we've been able to ascertain from limited testing of the robustness of these having a longer average and fiddling with the paired offspring age difference a little doesn't change much in the story as such. But the question that should be addressed is 40 a good year to measure long-run income or not? Now, the way in which that can be addressed is by taking replicating the work that Stephen Heider and Gary Solon and also my colleague Matthew Lindqvist did later on, and formulated generalized errors in variables models where we think that annual incomes depends on your permanent income. This is now in one form. On your permanent income and an annual deviation from that. But permanent income loads onto annual incomes by an age-dependent factor lambda. When lambda is roughly equal to, and here the assumption is that these transitory errors are orthogonal to permanent income. When lambda is roughly equal to 1, this is a classical measurement error model, and we know the consequences of that quite well. So what you want to do is to use ages when that's roughly true. And in both the US and Sweden, for earnings and for factor income, lambda is roughly equal to 1 around age 40 for men. But we don't really know very much about the different income concepts. Well, let's actually skip this. So for a limited subset of these cohorts, for cohorts 1948 to 1954, I've taken average income across each of these income concepts for ages 20 to 64 to measure lambda in the data. And this is what it looks like for some reason. Okay. I've now used this is 20 to 60. It looks relatively similar. I do 20 to 64. I guess I took 20 to 60 here because that way I can have more of these, more cohorts. And there's bad news and there's good news. The good news is that lambda is roughly equal to 1 for men around age 40, and in fact, between ages 40 and 50, but we're taking a 5-year slice here around 40. Doesn't look like it's catastrophic. For women, this thing is all over the place. That's kind of bad news, and indeed for different income. So, but at age 40, while it's below lambda, the different cohorts are relatively close to each other. So what consequences? So lambda should be close to 1 for this to be good news. It's not, but at least it doesn't vary tremendously across cohorts. Interestingly, the lambda equals to 1 creeps upwards in age when you move to different income concepts. So this is disposable family income. And by now, lambda is equal to 1 at age 50. But our data were constructed on the assumption that we'd be measuring things at age 40. So that's what we have to do here. These things show the multiplicative bias, if you will, in estimating the intergenerational persistence parameter at different ages of the offspring. And for you to get an unbiased, this depends on both the error variances from year to year and these lambdas. To get good estimates, this of course should be 1, and it's unbiased. It's very far from it, but the good news here is that again, it doesn't vary very much. Around age 40, it doesn't vary much across these cohorts. So we'll proceed, but with some caution in what we do. These are cross-sectional Gini coefficients. They're somewhat oddly for the age range 31 to 68, which you ignore the black line that's there by mistake. It's the broadest cross-section we could get from 1968 to 2018 was to look at 31 to 68-year-old, which is a very odd combination of ages, but that's the one we have. You see that the inequality, as measured by the Gini coefficient, declined substantially for all income concepts, but perhaps least so for disposable income, attained a minimum in the 1980s and had increased thereafter, but not to quite as high levels as it was earlier. When we take our 5-year averages, we get similarly a steep decline early on, an increase back, but then around the year 2000, the trends diverge somewhat. So the cross-sectional 1-year inequality measures continue to increase. The increase kind of stops for these 5-year averages. Don't know quite why, but that happens again. Ignore the final panel. But that's the Gini coefficient evolution, if you will, in these 5-year averages. So much of the time, the trends are similar, but then something happens here, which so this seems to be. Now, this is the relative intergenerational elasticity, the father-son elasticity across the cohorts we have stopping in 1975. We have a steep increase here at the outset. But then it kind of reaches around 0.26, where it stays across time. But these are fathers and sons. If we look at our preferred population and our preferred income measure, this is disposable family income or household income, that's wrong. We have an increase, but then a somewhat different shape than for the father-son elasticity. But interestingly enough, at the end, it's roughly of similar magnitude, but it arrives in different ways. And then the full matrix, the 9 times 9 matrix, we have both and all this. It's this one here. Fathers and sons are down here. We see that for all individual income concepts, in the both parents, all persons category, we have a trend-wise increase. Well, exactly a linear trend, but all the same, we have an increase in persistence, but disposable family income kind of goes up and then it stays roughly at the same level, and then it increases. And at the end, all of these are roughly of similar magnitude. Whereas in the father-son case, you mostly have this thing that it goes up and then it stays up roughly. What you want to conclude from this is something of an open issue, but let's say that we conclude that intergenerational persistence is increasing across time. Yes.
Those cohorts which are very narrow in age group, are they here?
They are here. It's roughly I think the first 3 ones. It's the parents' birth years which were, but again, for all parents, we still measure incomes always when they're 40 years old.
So that we shouldn't be worried about comparing those early ones with the rest.
Some wariness may be warranted. So
because that's where a lot of the big increase is happening, right?
A lot of the big increase is happening there. That's true, and we can do a little bit of looking at the robustness of that. But even kind of abstracting from those, even if we start from here, we still have this quite increase in persistence. And in fact, that it's quite flat for these early cohorts.
There, right? It's the father-son that it's
in the father-sons that it's these, in fact, as these things come and go, These do seem a little low side from what we know from earlier literature, whereas this is about the level that we're expecting to get. But nobody's done this kind of trend stuff, to the best of my knowledge, in quite this way before. So it looks, the details vary a little bit if we look at rank correlations instead of elasticities, but the basic story is relatively similar. We have more differences perhaps between the different income concepts in this both and all category. But this is the intergenerational persistence part of the story. What about the others? Now, I'm sorry. I also took a look at these in-law things. So this was for labor income and for disposable family income for the different population combinations of parents and offspring, both own and with respect to in-law incomes, the elasticities. And they do mostly track each other relatively well, especially if you look at the both and all category. Then you have some variation in the across different concepts. So this again is our preferred measure. But we don't have this thing that Tony found that the elasticity were really like turned the other way around. In this Swedish case, the in-law elasticities are mostly, but not always, below the own parent elasticities. But it does say something about the strength of assortative mating, because that's the way in which you get this association with the in-laws these are the intragenerational rank correlations between annual income and overtime average. They jump around quite a bit, but the scale here is very narrow. This is 0.8 to 0.9, and of course, across 5 years, the rank correlations are quite low. We should probably calculate this for longer. But they're at best, so to speak, stationary. And again, well, there's a big jump for some reason here in disposable personal incomes. The range of even this jump is quite small, and mostly they're here up in the 0.9 territory. So we conclude that not much has been happening with intragenerational mobility. What about assortative mating? This is organizing by the birth cohort of the women, the rank correlation between spouses, incomes. I've added years of education here. That's at the top here. Those are typically quite high when we look at them, but looking at the different income concepts. Again, this is measuring incomes as 5-year averages at age 40 in each case. We do have in the factor income, we have a little bit of a decline initially, but it's quite modest. But for the other income concepts and also for factor income later on, we do have an increase in the rank correlation. So assortative mating is increasing. Now, of course, it would be nice to be able to say more about the why of assortative mating. Why has it been increasing? Of course, it would be nice to know why the intergenerational things have been increasing as well. But here, I think there's a little more, but the measurement issues are kind of complicated. So the previous one was for incomes measured at age 40. But it's the W of when should we assess incomes for purposes of assortative mating isn't entirely clear. So should we look at the long run income in 5 years, which isn't all that long, but should we look at maybe annual income, which is what people often do look at, or should we take an even longer run view and take these 20 to 60 measurements of average incomes. The problem with all of these, of course, is that they're endogenous in different ways. Because you also get a kind of if you do look at annual income, it might be tempting to look at incomes in the year before marriage, but of course then people are very young and income hasn't stabilized into its longer run trajectory. So all of these are kind of complicated. And then how is it the birth cohort that is the interesting thing, or is it when they got married, which is the thing of interest? And it's in particular, if we want to look at particular policy interventions, that these things matter quite a lot. For this descriptive stuff, doing what I just did is sufficient. But here are some of the things that we've been looking at. The vertical black lines here. So here we've organized assortative mating by the year in which the couple married. This is for first marriages only. So in 1971, labor incomes became separately taxed in Sweden. And then different parts of non-labor income became separately taxed at later years. But in the sense that probably the most important one is this 1971 thing. But here, we're looking at years of education, but also long-run income measured at age 40, which can of course be completely different than the year of marriage, and in most cases is. But seeing anything from this is something of an issue. One thing which you do see minor traces of, most clearly here in years of education, is not related to separate taxation. But in 1989, Sweden abolished survivors' pensions. So after marriages entered from 1st of January 1990, the wife was not entitled to survivor's pension any longer, where she was before that. And there's a huge spike in number of marriages in 1989. And you see it very clearly here in the years of education. The population getting married in that year were clearly different than anybody else. So in fact, this is our greatest hope for getting any policy intervention that matters. Yes.
So one issue of the endogeneity, right, is how do you interpret, for example, this very steep dark green line? I mean, do we interpret it as saying the behavioral thing that's changing is that people are marrying like with like more often? Whereas in fact, because it's 5-year marriage, so maybe not. But I'm thinking the other thing that could change is the behavioral response within marriage, right? So for example, it could be that in the earlier years, women would then work less when they had childbirth, whereas in the later years, I know it's Sweden, but still, and later on less so. So this kind of responses now, because it's by year of marriage, maybe less a problem.
But it's definitely many years ago we did some work with Nordic countries, except Sweden, where we tried to look more in particular into this, and rewarding that framework again. We have nothing on the supply here, unfortunately, because it requires. We can get some leverage with education and labor incomes and so on, but it's not.
If the idea is to get a background,
yeah, wouldn't
it be interesting to look at it, since you have it, by the parents' permanent income?
I've tried that also. I screwed it up somehow, so I haven't had time to go back to it. But yes, that's my idea. We have a limited window for doing that, but that's exactly my idea, to look at it by. I want to show this is now for a limited number of birth cohorts. where again, I organize people by year of marriage. This is labor income, this is factor income. But now I change the measurement period of income. But the red is annual income in the year before marriage, I think. The green is long run average measured at age 40, and the blue is permanent income, the 20 to 60 measure for these. For what we 65, sorry. That was my belief when I did the slides. And again, we still have these black things that much important is the labor income thing. We see steep movements in the correlation at year of marriage. But this can be driven by all kinds of things, including the maturing of the baby boomers and all kinds of things. So interpreting this in terms of the labor supply response, I think, is premature. But again, look at 1989, the year when survivors, when lots of cohabiting couples married, because after the end of the year, the wives were not entitled to survivor's pension. They had a huge dip in the assortative mating parameter on all of these different measures, including permanent long run and annual income. So the populations marrying at that point were different. What you learn from this kind of one, it's a one-off change, of course. So what you can do with that is something of an open issue. But it is of interest. One of the wild things about this, I've been interested, so I've looked at this a little more, and there's the political economy a few years back, which makes a big deal of this. And I learned two different things from this. One is that there's seasonal variation in divorce risk depending on what time of the year you marry it, which by 2 to 3 percentage points, which is not small, considering that if you look at the 10-year, the risk of divorce within 10 years, that's around 30%. So 2 to 3 variation is quite a bit. But the other thing is that these people actually divorce less. So even if their assortative mating correlation is much less than for normal marriages, the divorce risk is substantially lower. But again, what you make of that is something of an open issue, but it's all the same. So this point, this is really just staring at the data and wondering aloud what we're seeing, but all the same. From the point of view of evaluating, in a sense, the intergenerational persistence in the long run in Sweden, we have increasing intergenerational persistence, and in fact, there. So again, I didn't really say anything about absolute mobility, but there, the W's matter a lot for absolute mobility as well. What we can say about these changes really depends very much on who we're looking at and what resources we're looking at. So it's very important to be specific on these. You can't just say that, well, let's do some sensitivity analysis. It's fundamentally, it could be very different. And taking then the welfare interpretation of this increasing persistence, stable intragenerational mobility, increasing assortative mating. Taken from this perspective, we would argue, with abstracting from what's happened to average incomes and things like that, we'd argue that the patterns imply worsening of social welfare, taking this longitudinal perspective. That's it.
So thank you for your presentation. We now have about 5 minutes for questions. I see that there is already one question from the audience. Those that are attending online can use the tool to signal they want to ask a question, and they will be allowed following the audience question.
Two quick questions. I think the first maybe is related or kind of similar to one of Chico's questions about the parents. Are you able to kind of measure assortative mating between the families? So not, and because that could be interesting, or like maybe not so much in Sweden, but if we think about in the United States, the income of the parents is the one that decides, for example, to which universities you go and this kind of stuff. So that would relate more and would be a better measure in that sense.
That's on the agenda. We can't do trends in those. That's the thing. This is we're very much focused on trends, but yes, we can. And so we can do a point in time for a few cohorts. We can look at the parental backgrounds and compare it with these other, and that's on the agenda, so to speak.
And then the other one about this trend in the marriage and then the persistence and stuff like that. I mean, in general in the world and in other countries specifically too, there's a big trend in less people getting married over time. So maybe what you see in the increase in the trend is more that the people that are getting married are the ones that are more similar to each other, more than a cohabitant kind of persistent.
That's a possibility. In part for that reason, but also because I was interested in looking at this 1989 phenomenon. We have a gap in our data, so we can look at cohabitation from population censuses. But the population census was last done in 1990. It kind of became register based after that. But from there we could go backwards every 5 years. And I've compared, for instance, divorce, separation risks for cohabitors and married couples using those. And then again, we don't have it in our data, but from 2011 onwards, you can again do a register-based version of cohabitation. And so we don't have in our data. But so to some extent we can work with that. We can, for instance, look to what extent, at least before 1990, this is an issue of different kinds of people getting formally married. But we haven't done so yet. But it's a point well taken.
Thanks. I just have this feeling, I think intergenerational mobility issues are incredibly important. And I'm somehow, when I hear talks, I just feel maybe someone's missing out on the really big picture. So let me just say a couple of things. In the past, I think, if I go back to my generation, virtually nobody went to university. It was a relatively small thing. A generation before me, nobody owned their own house. They just rented houses. And so in the middle of the last century, at least in Britain, there was this movement. Lots of people managed to buy their own house. Secondly, people started going to university. There was amongst my 15 cousins or so, 2 of us went to university, the first in our family, all the generations we could think of that had done that. Now, of course, many more people go to university, and you think that's a good thing for intergenerational purposes. But of course, what happens now is people go to university. There's lots more, but they go to universities where you think the sort of degree they're getting, maybe they're not ones which are going to do much for their incomes. And secondly, they're going to get loaded with a whole load of student debt. So there's a sense in which that avenue for mobility has declined, and also buying your own house now. Any sort of even low middle class person could aspire to that in the past. Now you feel that there's a situation where it's becoming increasingly difficult. And you look and think, I think the whole society is breaking down into 2 groups now. One of them is, if you like, middle class people have reasonable incomes. The other factor, which I think is quite important, is people didn't live that long in the middle of the last century. Now they do. So pensions have become a lot more important. And whether or not people just have state pensions or whether they have private pensions at all makes a huge difference. So now we have sort of 2 groups. One family that's reasonably well off. They can support their kids. The kids go to university. They go to good universities. They get degrees which are going to give them good incomes. They get help from their families to buy assets.
and they have a decent pension when they retire. So they look after themselves, and they also pass a huge amount on to inheritance. This stuff here neglects completely the huge impact of what is going on in inheritance, not just at death, but also during life in form of various sorts of transfers. And that is getting, I know from my data, wealth to income ratio has gone up now considerably over the last 20 years. That means there's a lot more wealth that's going to be passed on. And then you get these, so this other group where you've got families who, they go to university, yes, but they're also loaded with a whole load of debt. They're not expected to get any help from their families. They find it incredibly difficult to get housing. If they do, they get a mortgage, and they're really quite constrained. And society is sort of almost splitting into two halves. I don't know what proportion are in those two groups, but I feel I don't see anyone that's really addressing these sort of questions. I'm not really blaming you. I'm just saying it seems to me that there's a big issue out there, and just saying how much. And when we're splitting into two halves, I think that means in the future there's not going to be that amount of mobility between these two groups. The other thing, of course, is assortative mating. People used to just meet their partners at random down the pub or at a dance or something. Nowadays they're online, and they do a week's research before they go out to. There's a sense in which there's all these factors which are going to, I think, make these distinctions more rigid. And partly, I think the one thing I would say about what you've done is the whole asset side of it is missing. If people get a house, it's not being really picked up in disposable income and so on, unless, sometimes you might be measuring, but the chances are one doesn't measure that. And that is a big factor in determining really people's living standards. And if you're passing on a house from one generation to another, that's a big transfer and a big element of rigidity there.
Yeah. All points are well taken. The house ownership and intergenerational mobility, and there's a lot of work in the UK actually on that, reflecting the fact that it's a very widely held concern. In the UK, it's probably less so in Sweden. For another, it simply isn't in the same way a matter of public concern. The big issues relating to housing markets in Sweden are really about the fact that especially recent immigrants have difficulty getting into rental housing. And it's a thing. From what we know of the from wealth taxation, which ended in Sweden in 2007, the patterns of it's very difficult to make out on the intergenerational side. Kind of what exactly you make of that is kind of hard in part because the distribution of wealth is so strange, and of course, housing wealth is for tax purposes valued very badly, and so the registers aren't very good sources of that kind. But they do measure financial wealth, but that ends in 27. A lot of these other things, of course, income generated from wealth. For those people who haven't found clever ways of hiding that income, that is included in the factor incomes here. So housing wealth isn't, but financial wealth, to the extent that it generates an income stream, that is included. But of course, for most of the population, it's really very, very small. But the other ones, the inheritance of housing and so on, that's largely missing here. So that's true. This is all based on income.
I'm very sorry, but we are already out of our schedule, so I have to conclude here. I have to thank Markus Jäntti for his presentation, and